I want to move on to another big story and significant story, and God, it's taken our government a while, and you would have heard in the news, finally an official decision that Hamas, all of Hamas, its military and, if you like, political or civilian wing, have been deemed a terrorist organisation. Why? Well, because they've launched numerous terrorist attacks, primarily against the State of Israel and its citizens. And on October the 7th of last year, they launched an horrific attack on men, women and children in Israel, young people at a rock concert. They killed thousands of people, committed numerous atrocities against the living and indeed the dead, and are now suffering the consequences of an Israeli response to that terrorism. Meantime, in New Zealand, we have naive renter mobs marching in our streets, waving Palestinian flags and yelling blood on your hands at our Prime Minister and government politicians. But what in practical sense will this official recognition of Hamas as a terrorist organisation in total have? And what in particular is our Jewish community's reaction to it? Well, we're joined now by David Cumin. David, been a long time coming this day.
Good morning, Sean. Up to more than 20 years, depending on when you count.
What does it mean in legal terms? Do you know? What does it mean now that all of Hamas is a terrorist group?
Well, essentially it means that the loophole has been closed and that anyone who had wanted to send money or participate in Hamas activities can't now claim that they were only supporting the, quote, political wing.
Okay. Did UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency or whatever it's called, that seems to have been involved in some of the terrorism, does that mean they also now, and the United Nations has to cease any association, or we don't facilitate that as New Zealanders with Hamas?
It should do in a fair and just world, but of course the United Nations has immunity from prosecution, which is an interesting situation because one would think that the events of October 7th were significant enough not just for New Zealand to wake up and designate Hamas, but also for the veil of immunity to be pierced. And we'll see if any lawyers are going to take that one on. But there is a carve-out in our legislation as well that says if it's for humanitarian reasons and people have taken appropriate steps, then of course we should be supporting the people of Gaza, even though Hamas is in control. Excuse me. The problem, though, with that is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade have told us that they have not done a risk analysis on how much of our money goes towards terror. And they are well aware that our money does support schools that teach children to glorify the murder of Jews. So as far as I'm concerned, our government has been complicit in supporting the terror. And I hope that we do also relook at our funding to that organisation and look at alternatives.
All right. This came with, if you like, a softening blow because the government didn't want to be, it was political really. They also at the same time imposed travel bans on a number of Israelis who have been outspoken about building settlements in what would be called the occupied territories or on previously, Palestinian land, I guess.
No, I think it's a bit more serious than that, actually. I think the travel ban is for Israelis who have committed or participated in acts of violence. So, technically, they generally are, if there's evidence, tried and prosecuted in an Israeli court and wouldn't be allowed to travel to New Zealand anyway. And so I think your first point is entirely right. This is a political move, and it's really disappointing that our government has decided to play politics with national security.
Yeah. David, this is this comes part in a context where globally there has been a rise in anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist rhetoric in New Zealand. It's been led by a guy called John Minto, who runs a rather questionable organisation with very close ties or warm relations, it would seem, with our mainstream media. He can get his lying, hateful ads run to get rent-a-mob out in the streets waving Palestinian flags. The New Zealand Jewish Council can't get ads calling for calm, restraint and respect published in those same newspapers, who then cry, oh, that would be dangerous to run. But I have noted and interviewed Mr. Minto, who has been less than forthcoming about the donations he asks for, who runs the bank account those donations go into, and where that money might ultimately end up. And if there's a suspicion that it might be going to Hamas or organisations associated with it, surely we now need to look at that, given they are a terrorist organisation.
Yeah, I agree. There are a number of organisations in New Zealand that have raised funds for and sent it to Gaza, and as soon as you send any money to Gaza, it's likely to end up in Hamas, as we're seeing with even the aid that the UN is trying to facilitate. So this change in legislation does not give anyone the excuse to say that they thought it was only going to the political wing, if at all.
Okay. Do you think it will stop Rent a Mob every Saturday marching or Sunday marching down Queen Street with their Palestinian flags and their tea towels on?
If anyone does know what might stop that, then I think we'd all like to know. I think that this move would might give them even more fuel, because it's something else to rail against. And I see that yesterday Mr. Minto put out a statement saying that he didn't think that Hamas should be designated as a terror organisation. He sees it as a legitimate resistance movement, which is disgusting given their history of indiscriminate and
well, we'll try and get him on. Ben, note this down.
October 7th.
Yeah, we'll try and get him on next week, Mr. Minto, to see what he makes of it. Meantime, where do the leadership of Hamas reside? Because they're not in Rafah and they're not in Gaza. Where do they live, the people who run Hamas?
So the senior leaders are based in Qatar.
Okay, so here's a question for you. Do we need to now diplomatically protest to Qatar, or does this country need to change its relations with Qatar, given that it's harbouring leaders of a terrorist organisation?
Again, in an ideal world, that should have been happening for many years. I'm not sure what influence New Zealand truly has, and one of the reasons that was given for not designating Hamas or Hezbollah, by the way, which is still also artificially split by New Zealand, has been that it might, quote, affect our future national interests. And there's no one that I've talked to that doesn't understand that to mean some sort of trade implications. And so asking the government now to start putting pressure on Qatar, I think is unlikely to happen, even though it would be the right thing to do.
That would seem to be a natural consequence of the decision that was made yesterday. And we'd be complete hypocrites if we didn't.
Unfortunately, I've come to learn that politics is full of hypocrites and hypocrisy, and we only need to look at the last decades of funding UNRWA, while our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade staff have known that the schools that we give money to have glorified the murder of Jews.